Jonas Abbott had built every inch of that ranch with his hands and his heartache, and the woman he built it for never came back to see it. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was still a wild, untamed thing, a land of red dust and burning sky, of cattle drives and rattlesnakes and men who came west to outrun their pasts. Jonas had come west for a different reason altogether. He had come for love, or at least the promise of it, and he had stayed because the land got into a man's blood the way nothing else could, and because he had nowhere else to go once the love ran dry. Her name had been Clara Whitfield, and she had been the kind of beautiful that made a man stupid. They had grown up together in Missouri, in a small town called Hardin's Creek, and Jonas had loved her with the singular, consuming devotion that only a young man who has never been truly hurt yet can manage. He was 22 when he left Missouri heading west, and Clara had promised to follow. She said she would wait for the letters. She said she would come as soon as he had something worth coming to. She had pressed her lips against his cheek in the early morning darkness, and she had said the words that he would replay in his mind for the next 4 years. She said, "Build me something beautiful, Jonas." So he did. He found the land in the Cimarron Valley, 40 miles east of Santa Fe, where the mountains turned purple in the evenings, and the grass grew thick and green along the creek banks, and the soil was good and deep and willing. He built the main house with pine timber he hauled down from the mountains himself, working alongside a half-Navajo man named Thomas Runningwater, who became the closest thing to a friend that Jonas had ever known. He built the barn, the bunkhouse, the smokehouse, the well. He strung fence line for 3 straight weeks, until his hands were so torn up that Thomas made him wear cloth wrapped around his palms like bandages. He bought cattle, 12 head at first, then 30, then 60. He hired 2 ranch hands, brothers from Texas named Pete and Cal Dunmore, who were rough and honest and good with horses. He wrote letters to Clara every month. She wrote back for the first 2 years, then less frequently, then not at all. He received a letter in the spring of 1876. He was 26 years old by then, and the ranch was already something worth being proud of. And the letter was not from Clara but from her younger sister, Abigail. It was brief and kind and devastating in the way that only true things can be. Clara had married a banker in St. Louis. She had been married for 4 months already by the time the letter found him. She was happy, Abigail wrote. She was sorry she had not written herself, but she wanted him to know from someone. Jonas sat on the porch he had built with the particular detail of a man imagining a woman sitting on it, watching the sun go down over his land, and he held that letter until the paper went soft from his grip. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, not since his father had knocked that particular habit out of him by the time he was 9 years old. But something inside him, something warm and open that had kept him going through the cold nights and the hard work and the loneliness, went quiet, like a lantern running out of oil. He kept working. That was what a man did. You kept working. 2 more years passed. The ranch grew. He had 120 head of cattle now, and Thomas had a wife, a Pueblo woman named Rosaria, who made the best cornbread Jonas had ever eaten, and who looked at Thomas with a steadiness that Jonas recognized as the kind of love that doesn't make noise but holds everything up. He hired a 3rd hand, a young man named Billy Greer who was 19 and fresh off the stagecoach from Kansas and eager as a puppy. The ranch ran well. Jonas was 28 years old and successful by any measure that the territory cared to apply, and he was lonelier than he had ever been in his life. The town nearest to the ranch was called Redrock, population 340 souls, with a general store, a livery, a saloon, a church, a doctor who was more often drunk than not, and a telegraph office that had been there for 2 years and still seemed to excite everyone who used it. Jonas went into Redrock twice a month for supplies, and once in a while he would sit at the bar in the Silver Nail Saloon and drink 1 glass of whiskey slowly and listen to other people have conversations, and then he would ride home again in the dark. It was the telegraph office that changed everything, and it changed it in the way that most truly important things change, by accident, with no ceremony, with no warning at all. Margaret Slater was 26 years old when she boarded the eastbound stage in Denver, Colorado, on a Thursday in April of 1878. She was traveling to a town called Redrock, Kansas, where she had arranged through 4 months of letters and considerable anxiety to meet a rancher named George Aldrich who had advertised in a Denver newspaper for a wife. Margaret was a school teacher, had been one for 4 years, and was the kind of woman who made decisions with her brain first and her heart a distant second. She was not particularly romantic about the arrangement. She was, to be exact, practical about it. She was 26, unmarried, living in a rented room above a bakery in Denver, and the West was an unforgiving place to be a woman alone and without family. Her parents were both dead, her father from a fever in 1874, her mother from grief a year after that. She had one brother, Daniel, who was in the army and stationed somewhere in Wyoming that he couldn't exactly name in letters. She was, in short, alone. George Aldrich had sounded decent enough in his letters. He was 41, which was older than she had hoped, but he was polite and grammatically correct in his correspondence, and he had a successful cattle operation in Kansas. She was not marrying for love. She understood that. She was marrying for stability and safety and the plain comfort of having a place in the world that was hers. What she did not account for was the spring storm that came rolling down out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on that Thursday afternoon like something biblical. The sky turned green-yellow, and the thunder came in long, rolling crashes, and the stagecoach driver, a stubborn, red-faced man named Otis, made a decision that would alter the course of at least 2 lives. He pulled off the main road to shelter at a way station, and in the blinding, sideways rain, he took a wrong fork in the road and did not realize it until the storm had passed, and the late afternoon sky had cleared to that particular shade of deep blue that comes after a hard rain in the southwest. They were in New Mexico territory. They were, specifically, on a road that led to Redrock, New Mexico, and not Red Rock, Kansas, which was 140 miles northeast. Otis figured this out when he recognized the mountain formations and swore loudly and with great creativity for approximately 2 full minutes. His 3 passengers, who were Margaret and an elderly Mexican couple named the Garcias who were traveling to visit their daughter, climbed out and stretched their legs in the clean-washed air while Otis consulted his compass and his conscience. "The wheels cracked," Otis announced, after going around the coach 3 times and kicking it. "One of the rear ones. Can't push on tonight with a cracked wheel. There's a town about 6 miles up this road. We'll go in tonight and I'll get the wheel fixed in the morning." Margaret looked at him with the measured patience that comes from 4 years of managing a classroom of 12-year-olds. "And how far does that put us from Red Rock, Kansas?" 2 days at the least," Otis said, looking extremely uncomfortable. "Maybe 3. Margaret breathed carefully through her nose. She looked up at the wide New Mexico sky, which had turned completely clear and was filling up with the first early stars of the evening. She thought about George Aldrich waiting at a stage stop in Kansas. She thought about her one traveling bag and the careful, sensible dress she had worn for meeting him. She thought about the fact that she was standing in the middle of a territory that was not the one she was supposed to be in, with mud on her boots and her hair coming loose from its pins. "All right," she said, because what else was there to say? "Let's go to the town." Redrock on a weekday evening was quiet in the way that small western towns go quiet at dusk, not empty, but settled, with the sounds of the saloon warming up and the smell of wood smoke and horse and dust. The Garcias went to the one boarding house in town, run by a widow named Mrs. Hensley, who was built like a barn door and had a face like warm bread. Margaret followed them and paid for a room out of the careful money she had in her purse, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room, and she wrote a letter to George Aldrich explaining what had happened and asking him to wait, and then she went to find dinner. The only place to eat in Redrock that wasn't the saloon was a small restaurant operated by a woman named B. Fulton, who served beans and salt pork and corn bread and strong black coffee, and considered this a complete and nutritious meal, which it essentially was. Margaret sat at the long table and ate and listened to the conversations around her, which were mostly about cattle prices and the weather and a man named Patterson, who had apparently done something scandalous that everyone already knew about. It was at B. Fulton's restaurant that Margaret first heard the name Jonas Abbott. Two men at the end of the table were talking about him, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of familiarity that small towns apply to their known quantities. One of the men, a stocky fellow with a sheriff's badge on his vest, was saying that Jonas had brought in 40 head to sell at the Albuquerque market and gotten a fair price, and the other man, thinner and with a weathered face like old saddle leather, was shaking his head and saying it was a shame. "What's a shame?" Margaret asked, because she was by nature curious, and because the conversation was happening loud enough that she didn't feel she was intruding. The thin man looked at her with the frank assessment that Western men gave to women they didn't recognize, trying to categorize her quickly. "You passing through?" he asked. "My stagecoach had an accident," she said. "I'm waiting for the wheel to be repaired." The sheriff, she learned his name, was Carl Hooper, and that he had been sheriff of Redrock for 6 years and was reliable at his job and unreliable with his wife's cooking, which he constantly praised to her face and then privately described to everyone else as terrible, seemed to decide she was harmless and trustworthy. "Jonas Abbott," he said, "good man. Runs one of the finest cattle operations in the valley. Built that whole ranch himself from nothing." "And the shame," Margaret said. "Built it for a woman," the thin man, whose name turned out to be Frank, said. "Woman back in Missouri. Wrote him letters. He built the whole thing thinking she was coming. She married somebody else. He's been out there alone ever since. That was 2 years back. He's a proud man," the sheriff said. "Won't talk about it, but you can see it on him. All that work and nothing to come home to." Margaret thought about this in the neutral, observing way she thought about most things. She thought it was sad, in the way that wasted work and misplaced love is always sad, and then she finished her coffee and went to bed. She had no intention of thinking about Jonas Abbott again. She had George Aldrich waiting in Kansas and a practical future to get back to. But the wheel on Otis's coach was worse than he'd said. The local wheelwright, a deliberate German man named Mueller who took his craft personally, looked at the damage and told Otis it would take 3 days minimum. There was a crack running along the inside rim that needed careful work, and Mueller was not a man who rushed things that should not be rushed. 3 days. Margaret stood outside the livery in the April morning sunshine and did her calculations. 3 days in Redrock. She had enough money to stay at Mrs. Hensley's boarding house, but barely. She thought about asking B. Fulton if she needed any help in the restaurant, or Mrs. Hensley if there were any tasks she could do in exchange for reduced board. But before she got to either of those, something else happened. She was walking past the schoolhouse, a small, single-roomed building set back from the main street, with a bell on the roof that was tilted at a sorrowful angle, when she saw a cluster of children sitting outside on the steps with no teacher in sight, and the look of people who have decided to officially be on holiday. She stopped. She could not help it. 4 years of teaching had given her a reflex that was practically involuntary. "Why aren't you inside?" she asked. A boy of about 10 with 2 missing front teeth looked at her with interest. "Miss Kavanaugh went home sick," he said. "She gets sick a lot." "Can you all read?" Margaret asked, a general uncertain shuffling. "Some of us can," the boy said. Margaret looked at the schoolhouse. She looked at the 8 or 9 children on the steps. She looked at the tilted bell and thought that someone should really fix that before it fell on someone. "Go inside and sit down," she said. "I'll teach you today." She didn't know why she did it. Or perhaps she did, because it was what she knew, and because she was stuck in this town for 3 days, and because the sight of unsupervised children outside a schoolhouse activated something deep and professional in her. She spent the morning teaching them reading and arithmetic, and a little bit of history, and she found that she enjoyed it in the way you always enjoy the thing you were made to do when you get the chance to do it without complication. News in a town the size of Redrock traveled at a speed that was essentially instantaneous. By afternoon, it was known that the stranded schoolteacher was filling in for Miss Kavanaugh, and B. Fulton sent lunch over to the schoolhouse, and Mrs. Hensley told Margaret her room that night was on the house. Jonas Abbott came into Redrock that afternoon for nails and rope. He came in twice a month, as was his custom, and he tied his horse at the general store hitching post and went in and placed his order with the proprietor, a cheerful man named Simmons. And while Simmons was filling the order, Jonas stood by the counter and looked out the window at the street. He did this without thinking about it. He watched the horses, the few people moving between buildings, the sky above the flat roofs. He was not looking for anything. He had stopped looking for anything a while ago. But he noticed the woman coming out of the schoolhouse. He noticed her because there was something in the way she moved, purposeful, direct, with the kind of confidence that is not arrogance but certainty. She was carrying a slate board under one arm, and she had chalk dust on her dark blue dress, and her brown hair was coming loose from the braid she'd pinned it in, and she was looking at the tilted bell on the roof of the schoolhouse with an expression of genuine concern, the kind you give to a problem you intend to solve. "Who's that?" Jonas asked Simmons without entirely meaning to. Simmons looked. "Oh, that's the teacher." "Well, not the regular teacher. The regular teacher is Miss Kavanaugh, and she's down with some kind of chest ailment. That one came in on Otis's coach last night. Stagecoach took a wrong turn in the storm, if you can believe it. She's waiting for the wheel to be repaired. Stepped in to teach the children this morning without anyone asking her to." He paused. "From Denver, I think. Name's Margaret something. Slater, maybe." Jonas watched her for another moment. She had turned away from the bell and was talking to one of her students, a small girl who was holding up a piece of paper with something drawn on it, and the woman, Margaret Slater, bent slightly to look at it with genuine attention and said something that made the girl's whole face light up. Jonas took his supplies and went back to his ranch. He thought about her more than he wanted to on the ride home. There was nothing specific to think about. He had seen her for 30 seconds from across the street, but his mind kept returning to the chalk dust on her dress and the way she had looked at that bell like it was personally accountable to her. He told himself it was nothing. He was good at telling himself things were nothing. The next morning, Margaret was back at the schoolhouse early. She had borrowed a ladder from the livery, and she was standing on it, trying to straighten the bell, when she lost her balance on the top rung and would have come down hard onto the steps below except that someone caught her. The hands that grabbed her arms were strong and sure, and she found herself steadied against a solid chest, and when she stepped back and turned around, she was looking at a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, considerably taller than her, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 days of dark stubble, and eyes the color of the creek she'd crossed coming into town, that particular greenish-gray that water goes in the shade. He was wearing a work shirt and boots and a hat that had seen serious use, and he was looking at her with an expression caught somewhere between concern and something she couldn't name. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was low and direct. "No," she said, and then, because she was always honest even when honesty was not necessarily gracious, "I almost was." "Yes," he said, "you were." He looked up at the bell. "You need a different ladder. That one's got a broken brace on the 3rd rung." "I noticed that on the way down," she said, and then she looked at him properly. "Thank you, I'm Margaret Slater." "Jonas Abbott," he said, and held out his hand in the Western way, the direct, unembellished handshake of people who don't have time for formality but believe in courtesy. She shook it. His hand was rough from work, thoroughly, completely rough, the hands of a man who had built things. She had grown up around farmers and she recognized the texture. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. "6 miles out," he said. "I ranch, cattle mostly." "I heard about your ranch," she said, and then immediately wished she hadn't because she saw his expression change just slightly, just around the eyes, the way it does when you've accidentally touched something that is still tender. She understood in the half-second before he composed himself that she had repeated gossip she should have kept to herself, and she said, "I'm sorry. I was eating at Mrs. Fulton's last night and I overheard some men talking. I shouldn't have mentioned it." He looked at her steadily. He seemed to be deciding something. "It's a small town," he said finally. "People talk." "They do," she agreed. "It's usually about things that are none of their business." Something shifted in his face then, not a smile exactly, but the preliminary of one, the slight relaxation around the eyes. "What are you doing to the bell?" he asked. "Trying to straighten it," she said. "It's been tilted like that since I got here and it bothers me." "It's been tilted like that for 2 years," he said. "Then it's bothered me for approximately 14 hours, and it bothered the people of Redrock for 2 years without anything being done about it," she said. "Someone should have fixed it." He looked at the bell again. He looked at the ladder. And then, without further discussion, he went to the livery and came back with a better ladder, and he climbed up it and adjusted the bell mounting with a wrench from his saddlebag. And when he came down, the bell hung straight and level and looked like it had always meant to be that way. Margaret looked at it with satisfaction. "Thank you," she said. "You have students arriving," he said, because the children were indeed beginning to appear at the end of the street. He tipped his hat and walked back toward the general store, and Margaret watched him go for a moment with an expression she was not particularly aware of, and then turned back to her schoolhouse. She thought, "He is probably the saddest person I have ever seen who doesn't appear sad." She thought, "That is absolutely none of my business. I have a stagecoach wheel being repaired and a rancher in Kansas waiting for me." She went inside and began to teach. It was Thomas, running waiter, who suggested Jonas go back into town that afternoon, which was not something Jonas did when he'd just been in the day before. Thomas was perceptive in the quiet, observant way of a man who has learned to read the land and the people on it with equal care, and he had noticed that Jonas had returned from town the previous day with a slightly different quality of silence than his usual silence. Thomas had been watching Jonas Abbott be quietly miserable for 2 years, and he recognized the difference. "I need to pick up that additional order of fence staples," Jonas said, because they did need fence staples, though they were not urgent. Thomas said, in the particular noncommittal way that was completely committal. Jonas went back into Redrock. He told himself he was going for fence staples. He ended up at the schoolhouse. He wasn't sure exactly how it happened. He was walking past on his way to the general store, and he heard through the open window a voice reading something aloud. A woman's voice, clear and measured, with a natural rhythm that made you want to keep listening. And then he heard the children's voices responding, and there was a quality to it, a warmth, that made him stop on the boardwalk outside. He stood there for a full minute listening to Margaret Slater teach arithmetic through a story about a rancher who needed to figure out how many cattle he could afford to buy if each head cost $3, and he had $45, and he heard the children working through it with her, and he heard her laugh when a boy named Toby came up with the right answer before anyone else and looked stunned by his own competence. He went and got his fence staples. Then he did something he genuinely had not planned. He went to B. Fulton's and bought a small parcel of food beans, salt pork, a jar of B's preserved peaches, and a fresh corn bread wrapped in cloth, and he went back to the schoolhouse and left it on the step for when school let out, because it was nearly 4 o'clock, and he figured she'd been teaching since morning and probably hadn't eaten since breakfast. He did not leave a note. He wasn't sure what he would have written. Margaret found the parcel when she let the children out at 4, and she looked at it with puzzlement. The corn bread was still warm. She asked Toby, the arithmetic boy, if he'd seen who left it. "The rancher," Toby said cheerfully. "The tall one with the hat." He was outside listening for a while. Margaret looked down the street. She couldn't see him anywhere. She looked at the corn bread and the preserved peaches, and she felt something complicated and unexpected that she firmly set aside. She ate the corn bread standing on the schoolhouse step in the afternoon sun because she had, in fact, been hungry since noon. She saw Jonas Abbott an hour later, at the water trough near the livery, where he was filling his canteen before the ride back to his ranch. She walked directly over to him because she was not a woman who let things sit sideways when they could be addressed directly. "Did you leave the food?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes." "Why?" He seemed briefly uncertain, not uncomfortable exactly, but as though he hadn't prepared an answer, which was probably because he hadn't. "You'd been teaching since morning. Bee's kitchen was open." "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know that," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this tall, quiet, sad-eyed man who had built a ranch for a woman who never came and who had straightened a bell nobody, asked him to straighten and left food on a step without putting his name on it. "Would you like to sit somewhere and have coffee?" she asked. "B. Fulton's, I mean. I'd like to thank you properly." He looked surprised. She got the sense that surprise was not an emotion he was well acquainted with. "All right," he said. They sat at B's long table with 2 cups of strong black coffee and talked for 2 hours. It was not romantic conversation, not at first, or not obviously. It was the kind of conversation that people have when they are genuinely interested in each other's experience of the world. She asked about the ranch and he described it, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, because the ranch was real to him in a way that very few things were, and he could talk about the land without guarding himself. He told her about the Cimarron Valley and the color of the mountains in the evening, and the way the creek ran after a good rain. She told him about Denver and about teaching and about the particular pleasure of watching a child understand something they hadn't understood before. He did not ask her why she was in Redrock. She didn't volunteer it. She did not ask him about Clara Whitfield. He did not mention her. They drank their coffee and they talked, and the early evening came on and filled B's restaurant with warm lamplight. And when Margaret finally looked at the clock on B's wall and said she should get back to Mrs. Hensley's before it got too dark, Jonas stood and put on his hat and said, "I'm glad you straightened the bell." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded. He looked as though he wasn't sure what to do with the sound of it, but that he wanted to hear it again. "Good night, Mr. Abbott," she said. "Good night, Miss Slater," he said. She walked back to the boarding house in the blue evening air, and she thought about George Aldrich in Kansas, and she thought about the fact that the stagecoach wheel would be fixed in 1 more day, and she would be leaving, and she thought about Jonas Abbott's creek-colored eyes, and she thought, "Don't be foolish, Margaret." The next morning she woke up and wrote a second letter to George Aldrich explaining that she was further delayed. She did not examine too closely why she used the word "further," when in fact Mueller the wheelwright had told Otis that the wheel would be done by afternoon. She taught school again. The children had asked if she could come back after Miss Kavanaugh recovered, and she had told them honestly that she was only passing through, and they had looked at her with the particular disappointment of children who like a teacher and know it, and she had felt it more than she expected. Jonas came at noon. He came without the pretense of fence staples or anything else. He just appeared at the schoolhouse door when she let the children out for their midday break, and he said, "I thought you might want to ride out and see the valley, if you have the time." She looked at him and she thought, "This is not wise." "Yes," she said. He had brought 2 horses, his own big roan and a gentle brown mare he had borrowed from the livery. They rode out along the creek road in the bright April noon, and when the town fell behind and the valley opened up, Margaret understood what he had meant about the land. It was extraordinary in the way that New Mexico is extraordinary, vast and honest, with no sentimentality about it, beautiful the way a thing is beautiful when it does not know it is being observed. The mountains were clear and present against the blue sky, and the grass along the creek was the vivid green of new growth, and the air smelled of sage and water and something she couldn't name, but that felt old and clean. She did not talk, and he did not talk, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silences between people of similar natures sometimes are. They stopped at the top of a small rise that looked out over the whole valley, and she could see, far across the green and gold of the grassland, the buildings of his ranch, the main house and the barn and the outbuildings, small in the distance but solid, real, more substantial than she would have expected from something one man had built. "You built all of that," she said. "It was not a question." "With help," he said. "Thomas Runningwaiter helped me with most of it. He's been with me from the start. Good man." "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something, the way you feel weather changing before you can see it. "I built it for someone who didn't come," he said. He said it simply, without drama, in the voice of a man who has made his peace with something without quite finishing that process. "I know," she said gently. "I heard about it the first night I was here. I'm sorry." "It's all right," he said. "The ranch is mine now, regardless of why I built it. The land doesn't care about the reason. It just is what it is." She thought that was one of the truest things she had heard anyone say, and she looked at him sideways and thought, "Who are you, Jonas Abbott, and what am I doing on this hillside with you when I have a practical future to get to?" "What about you?" he said. "Where are you going?" "Not just where's your coach taking you. Where are you going?" She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. "I'm going to Redrock, Kansas," she said. "I have an arrangement with a rancher there. I'm to be his wife." She said it the way she had always said it to herself, with the practical, unsentimental clarity of a woman who makes logical choices. But on this hillside in this valley with this man beside her, it sounded different in her ears than it usually did. He looked at her. She could not read his expression exactly, but she saw something move through it. "A mail-order arrangement?" he asked. "Essentially," she said. "I wrote to him after seeing his advertisement. We exchanged letters. He seems like a decent man." She paused. "He's 41. Jonas was quiet. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." She looked at the valley. "I'm practical, Mr. Abbott. I don't have family. I have very little money. The West is not gentle to women alone." "No," he said, "it isn't. So I made a practical decision." "That makes sense," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him, but his face was forward, toward the mountains. They rode back to town in a silence that had changed quality, thicker, more aware. He walked her back to the schoolhouse and she taught her afternoon session, and he sat outside on the step like a man with nowhere else to be, which she suspected was not true but didn't comment on. When the children left at 4, she came out and found him still there. "You stayed," she said. "I did," he said. "Why?" He looked up at the straight bell. He looked at his hands. He looked at her with those creek-gray eyes that she was beginning to understand held considerably more than they let on. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was honest and slightly devastating in its honesty. She sat down on the step beside him, not close. There was a full foot of respectful space between them, and they watched the afternoon shadows lengthen across the street of Redrock, and presently she said, "Tell me more about the ranch." He did. He told her about the first winter, when the cold came down off the mountains so sharp it frosted his mustache solid every morning, and the cattle moved in close to the creek banks for shelter. He told her about the time a mountain lion got into the chicken coop, and he and Thomas spent 3 days tracking it before persuading it to move on to better territory without anyone getting hurt. He told her about the creek flooding in the spring of 1876, and how it had taken the fence along the south pasture, and he and Pete and Cal had worked 4 straight days in the mud to rebuild it. He told her about Rosaria's cornbread and Thomas's dry, quiet humor, and Billy Greer arriving off the stagecoach with boots that were 2 sizes too big, and a completely unfounded confidence in his roping ability. She laughed at the roping story, and he looked at her with that expression again, like the sound surprised him and he wanted it to keep going. "You love it," she said. "The ranch, you genuinely love it." "Yes," he said, "I do." "That's good," she said quietly, "that it became yours. That it isn't just a shell of something you meant for someone else." He was still for a moment. "How did you know that's what it was?" "For a while. Because you said the land doesn't care about the reason it's worked. That's the kind of thing a person figures out when they've spent time wondering if the reason matters. He looked at her with a directness that was slightly unsettling, not threatening, but thorough, like being assessed by someone who actually sees clearly. "You're perceptive," he said. "I'm a teacher," she said. "You spend enough years watching people learn things, and you start to see the shape of what's being learned even before they say it." Mueller the wheelwright finished the stagecoach wheel that evening. Otis came to find Margaret at Mrs. Hensley's and told her they'd be leaving at first light the next morning, and the Garcias were already packed, and the weather looked clear. Margaret said she understood and thanked him and went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall for a while. She had been in Redrock 3 days. She had known Jonas Abbott for 3 days. She was leaving tomorrow for a man she had never met, to be his practical, sensible, unromantic wife in a state she had never lived in, for reasons that had seemed entirely sound before she had ridden up a hillside in the Cimarron Valley and seen what a man could build with his hands and his love, misplaced as it had been. She thought about all of this with great honesty, because Margaret Slater was above all honest with herself. She did not sleep well. In the morning she was packed and standing outside Mrs. Hensley's in the early gray light before Otis had the horses hitched, and Jonas Abbott was standing across the street. She did not know how long he had been there. She suspected he had ridden in before dawn. They looked at each other across the empty morning street. He crossed to her. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she noticed because it was the first time she had seen him not wearing it, and it seemed to mean something, a deliberate uncovering, like a man coming without armor. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said. "That's kind of you," she said. "I wanted to say," he stopped, started again. "I know you have a plan. I know you made it carefully and it makes sense, and I'm not going to stand here and be foolish about a woman I've known for 3 days. He stopped again. She waited. "But I wanted you to know, the valley. If you ever—" He put his hat back on. He seemed to be struggling with the particular embarrassment of a man who does not often speak what he feels. "I wanted you to know the valley was good, and you were good in it, and I'm glad the bell is straight." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about George Aldrich and Kansas and practicality, and she thought about the valley and the mountains going purple at evening and a man who built things with his hands for love and kept working when the love was gone. She said, "Mr. Abbott." "Jonas," he said. "Jonas," she said, and the name felt right in her mouth, which was alarming. If this arrangement in Kansas should not work out, for any reason, she stopped because she was not a woman who made rash statements. "I wanted you to know, I like the valley too." He looked at her with such intensity that she felt it somewhere behind her sternum. "All right," he said very quietly. Otis called that the horses were ready. The Garcias were settling into the coach. Margaret picked up her bag and Jonas took it from her without asking and carried it to the coach and put it in, and he held her arm to help her up the step in the way that was simply the courtesy of the time. And when she was seated and looked down at him from the window, he was standing with his hat in his hands again. The coach moved. She watched him in the window until the road curved and Redrock disappeared. She sat in the coach and listened to the sound of the wheels on the road, and she thought with great, careful, ruthless honesty about what she was doing. She had been honest with herself her whole life. She was going to be honest now. She felt, for Jonas Abbott, the particular pull of a person recognizing someone they were meant to know. She could call it attraction, or connection, or any of the practical words that made it smaller. But the truth of it was that she had felt more herself in 3 days in Redrock than she had in 4 years in Denver. George Aldrich was waiting in Kansas. She was going to Kansas. Redrock, Kansas was a different kind of town from Redrock, New Mexico, flatter, more settled, with more established buildings and a general air of a place that had decided what it was going to be. George Aldrich met the stagecoach. He was a tall man going to Gray, with a formal, careful manner and the look of someone who was also approaching this arrangement with practical intentions. He was not unkind. He was courteous. He helped her with her bag and walked her to the boarding house he had arranged for her, and he asked if she had traveled well. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were both attempting to make themselves feel something they thought they should feel, and neither of them was managing it, and they both knew it within 20 minutes of meeting. They ate dinner together at the local hotel dining room, a considerably fancier establishment than B. Fulton's, and they talked about his ranch and her teaching, and they were civil and pleasant and entirely, completely unmoved by each other. George Aldrich was a decent man who wanted a wife for many of the same practical reasons Margaret had been prepared to marry him. He had a well-organized ranch and a clear vision for his future, and no particular passion in his eyes when he looked at her. She did not have passion in her eyes when she looked at him, either. On the second day, she told him the truth. She told it simply and directly and without cruelty. She did not think she was the right wife for him, and she wanted to be honest about that before they went further. She could see the relief in his expression. He was too polite to show it fully, but it was there, the particular release of a man who has been holding something that wasn't quite right and has been given permission to set it down. He thanked her for her honesty. He said he hoped she would find what she was looking for. He even paid the stagecoach fare for her return trip, which was decent of him in a way that made her genuinely like him as a person if not as a prospective husband. She sent a telegram from Redrock, Kansas, to the telegraph office in Redrock, New Mexico, addressed to Jonas Abbott. It was brief because telegrams were expensive and brevity was, she felt, appropriate. The message said, "The arrangement did not work out. I find I am reconsidering the valley if the offer still stands. M. Slater." She sent it on a Wednesday. She was back on a westbound stage before she received any reply, which may have been impulsive, which she acknowledged, but which was also just the kind of decisive action she took when she had made up her mind about a thing. Jonas Abbott received the telegram on a Thursday morning. He was in the barn with Thomas, checking on a heifer that had been limping for 2 days. Thomas handed him the telegram from young Billy, who had brought it out from town, and Jonas read it twice and stood very still for a moment. Thomas, without looking up from the heifer's hoof, said, "What does it say?" Jonas read it aloud. His voice was very steady, but his hands were not entirely. Thomas listened, and then he said, which was a noise that could mean many things coming from Thomas, but in this case meant approximately, "I told you so, and also, go do something about it." Jonas sent a reply telegram that took him a considerable amount of time to write because he was not a naturally demonstrative man and telegrams required both brevity and clarity, and he needed to get this right. He stood in the Redrock telegraph office for 15 minutes composing, and the operator, a young man named Davis, waited with professional patience. The final telegram said, "The valley is here and so is the bell. Come back to Redrock and I will meet you at the stage stop. J. Abbott." It took 11 days for Margaret's westbound stage to make the trip back through Colorado and into New Mexico, because there were road delays and one broken axle that was not as dramatically misplaced as the first one but took 2 days to deal with regardless. These 11 days felt long to Jonas in a way that the previous 2 years had not, which told him something about the nature of expectation versus emptiness. He told Thomas about it. Thomas said, "Good." He told Pete and Cal that there would be a woman coming to the ranch who might be staying on. Pete nodded and said that was fine by him, and was she a good cook? Cal elbowed Pete for this and said he was sure she was welcome whatever her culinary abilities. Billy Greer looked so excited about the prospect of having a woman at the ranch who was not Rosaria, who was excellent but who had eyes only for Thomas and patience for Billy only up to a certain point, that Jonas had to tell him to settle down. Rosaria, when Thomas told her, went to the main ranch house the next day and cleaned it thoroughly and put a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table that she found along the creek. She said nothing about this when Jonas came in and found it. He said, "Thank you, Rosaria." She said, which was very similar to Thomas's noncommittal sounds and meant approximately, "I hope she's good enough for you." The stage arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks to the day after Margaret had first ridden into Redrock on the wrong road in the wrong storm, headed to the wrong place. Jonas was at the stage stop. He had been there for an hour, which was longer than necessary, and which he was not going to tell anyone about. He had brushed his hat and put on a clean shirt, and he had told himself 3 times on the ride into town not to be either too serious or too hopeful, and he was both. She came off the stage, and the first thing she did was look at the schoolhouse and check the bell. It was still straight. He saw the small smile when she verified it. Then she saw him. She had her traveling bag and she had chalk dust on her sleeve. She'd been teaching the children on the coach. He would learn later, because there had been a young family with 3 children aboard, and it had passed the time, and her brown hair was coming loose from its braid again. And she looked at him with those clear, direct eyes, and he thought, yes, this is exactly right. Mr. Abbott, she said. Jonas, he corrected. Jonas, she said, and her mouth curved. He took her bag. Welcome back to Redrock. I'd say I was glad to be back, she said, walking beside him, except that implies I left voluntarily, which I did, which makes the thing that followed it my own fault. Is that what you'd call it, a fault? I'd call it a course correction, she said. He looked at her sideways and felt something in his chest that had been tight for a very long time come slightly loose. Are you hungry? He asked. I've been on a stagecoach for 11 days, she said. I am monumentally hungry. He took her to B. Fulton's. They sat at the same table where they'd drunk coffee 3 weeks ago, and they ordered everything B had going that day, which was considerable. And they talked, but differently now, with the ease of people who have already established a ground between them and are now building on it. She told him about Redrock, Kansas, and about George Aldrich, and she was fair about it. She did not make Aldrich out to be the villain, because he wasn't one. He was a decent man, she said. We were just not right for each other, and we both knew it. Some people can ignore that. I couldn't. No, Jonas said. I don't think you could. I'm not built for ignoring things, she said. I noticed, he said, with a dry, quiet humor that she was learning to recognize and appreciate. First time I saw you, you were trying to climb a broken ladder to fix a bell that had been crooked for 2 years. Someone had to, she said. He looked at her across the table and he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who says things he means, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'll respect whatever you say, and I won't make it difficult for you if you say no. She folded her hands on the table. Ask it. Would you like to come and see the ranch? She was quiet for a moment, just to see it. To start, he said honestly. She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, serious man with the work-rough hands and the sad eyes that were not entirely sad anymore. She thought about the valley and the mountains and the straight bell, and the food left on the schoolhouse step without a name on it. She thought about practicality, and she thought about the particular foolishness of letting practicality become a wall around something real. She had been practical her whole life. She had been practical about her parents' deaths, and practical about her life alone, and practical about the arrangement in Kansas. She was not sure she wanted to be practical about this. Yes, she said, I would. He took her out to the ranch on a Saturday in May, with Redrock's mild approval and Mrs. Hensley's explicit blessing, and the suggestion from Sheriff Hooper that it was about time. She rode the brown mare from the livery again. The valley was in its full spring condition, and it was, as she remembered, extraordinary. The grass was thick, and the creek was running high from the snowmelt off the mountains, and the wildflowers were out along the slopes, yellow and purple, and the particular bright red of the paintbrush flowers that dotted the hillsides like small flames. She met Thomas and Rosaria. Rosaria looked her over with dark, careful eyes and then handed her a piece of corn bread, which Margaret ate and said genuinely was the best corn bread she'd had. Rosaria said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing, which was evidently acceptance. Thomas shook her hand and said, "It's good that you came back." She said, "It's good to be back." They seemed to understand each other. She met Pete and Cal, who were more awkward about it in the way of young men who don't know how to talk to respectable women, and end up being excessively polite. She met Billy Greer, who was 19 and enthusiastic, and immediately told her 3 things about roping that she did not ask about, and which she listened to with every appearance of interest because that was who she was. Jonas showed her the house. It was bigger than she'd expected from the outside, a proper house, not a temporary thing, with real windows and a wooden floor and a kitchen with a real iron stove, and a sitting room with 2 chairs by the window that looked out toward the mountains. It was not decorated much. There were no curtains, no pictures, the furniture was sparse and functional, but the bones of it were good. The bones of it were built by a man who had wanted it to be a real home. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the wildflowers Rosaria had put in the vase on the table, and she thought, someone could be very happy here. She turned around and Jonas was leaning in the kitchen doorway, watching her, and the look on his face was so carefully neutral that she could see exactly how much it was costing him to be neutral. "It's a wonderful house," she said. "It was built to be lived in," he said. "It's not been lived in enough." She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the good, real windows and lay across the kitchen floor in long golden bars. "Jonas," she said. "Margaret," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded careful and right. "I should tell you something," she said. "I don't want to be practical about this. I know that's not what I said I was when we first talked, but I've been practical for a long time and I don't want to be practical now." She stopped, feeling slightly exposed in a way that was new and not unpleasant. "I came back because of you, not because of the arrangement failing. I came back because of you." He pushed off from the doorway and crossed the kitchen, and he stood in front of her and he said very quietly, "I know. You do. I hoped," he said. "I know that's not the same thing, but I hoped." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the work-rough, calloused hand on the stubbled jaw of a man who had waited a long time for something that was worth waiting for, and he went very still in the way of a person receiving something they were afraid to move and break. "I think," she said, "that if you asked me to stay, I would stay." He put his hand over hers, the large, rough hand covering her smaller one. "Margaret Slater," he said, "will you stay?" "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in June, in the small white church in Redrock, with Sheriff Carl Hooper standing in as something like a father figure, since neither of them had one available, and Rosaria weeping happily through the whole ceremony, and Thomas standing beside Jonas with the dignified calm of a man who is thoroughly pleased and sees no reason to make a scene about it, and Billy Greer crying openly without any attempt to conceal it, and Pete and Cal pretending not to notice. B. Fulton did the wedding supper, which was extraordinary, and Mrs. Hensley decorated the church with wildflowers from the creek banks. Margaret wore her best dress, the dark blue one, and she had taken out the braid and left her hair in soft waves around her face, and Jonas looked at her walking down the aisle of that small church and he thought, "I built the wrong thing for the wrong woman, and somehow the right woman ended up here anyway, and the land does not care about reasons, and maybe that is the mercy in it." He said his vows in a clear, steady voice, and he meant every word of them. She said hers with her eyes on his face the whole time and her hands around his, and the certainty of a woman who makes decisions and does not unmake them. They rode back to the ranch in the long June evening, and the valley was pink and gold in the sunset, and the mountains were doing the purple thing that she had fallen in love with almost before she'd fallen in love with him, and she thought, "I was on the wrong stage going to the wrong town for the wrong man, and I have never in my life been more precisely where I was supposed to be." The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that people who have worked hard for a long time and finally have something good to come home to make the most of. They worked side by side. She did not consider herself a purely domestic creature, and Jonas did not expect her to be. She helped with the books, which had been kept adequately but not excellently, and she took them over with the same systematic intelligence she'd applied to teaching and improved them considerably. She all started teaching again, as Miss Kavanaugh had moved on to Albuquerque and the schoolhouse was empty. The town asked her, and she agreed without hesitation. Jonas rode into town with her twice a week, and spent those days doing business in Redrock while she taught, and then they rode home together. She learned to ride properly. She had known the basics, but the country demanded more, and Jonas taught her on weekend mornings patient, methodical lessons on the brown mare that she'd essentially claimed by now, a horse she named Thursday in honor of the day the storm had redirected her life. He was a good teacher in the way that he was good at most things, clear and unhurried and attentive to what she actually needed rather than what he assumed. She noticed that about him over and over, that he saw her, actually saw her, not the version of her he had expected or hoped for. She noticed also that he was gradually different than the man she'd first seen. Lighter somehow, less carefully defended. He laughed more, not loudly or frequently. He was still a naturally quiet man, but genuinely, without the self-consciousness that people have when they've gotten out of the habit of it. He sat on the porch with her in the evenings instead of sitting there alone, and the difference between those two things was enormous. She wrote to her brother Daniel in Wyoming. He wrote back enthusiastically and said he planned to visit as soon as his posting allowed, and he was glad she'd found someone. And he asked 3 questions about Jonas that were clearly designed to assess character, and she answered them all honestly and at length. In the fall of that first year, Thomas and Rosaria's first child was born, a boy they named Elias, who was small and loud and utterly perfect, and who Margaret held with the careful competence of a woman who knows children, and Rosaria watched with the pleased assessment of a woman who approves of how her baby is being held. Jonas stood in the doorway of their small house and watched Margaret with the baby, and he thought. Yes, he did not say this, but he thought it. It was Margaret who brought it up, because she was the one who said things directly. They were sitting on the porch on an October evening, the air sharp with the first cold of the coming winter, the mountains going purple-black in the dusk, and she said, "I've been thinking about children." He looked at her. "I want them," she said, "if that's something you want too." He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man registering something he's hoped for without letting himself hope. "Yes," he said, "I want that." She nodded with the settled confidence of a decision made and understood. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a boy. Jonas held him with enormous, almost terrified care, and then with growing steadiness, and he said very quietly to Margaret, who was exhausted and clear-eyed and proud as anything, "He looks like he means business." "He takes after his mother," Margaret said. "He takes after both of us," Jonas said, "which means he has no chance at a quiet life." They named him Henry Thomas Abbott, the middle name for the man who had been beside Jonas through everything, and who, when he heard the name, went outside and stood in the yard for a few minutes by himself, in the way of a man receiving something quietly. Henry was exactly as much as both of them had imagined, and considerably more work, which Jonas had intellectually understood, and was surprised by anyway. The ranch absorbed the disruption with its usual steadiness. Rosaria, whose Elias was now 18 months old and an enthusiastic destroyer of things within reach, helped Margaret through the first difficult weeks with the competent generosity of a woman who has recently done the same thing and remembers what it required. Billy Greer, who was 21 now and had significantly improved his roping, became obsessively devoted to Henry, in the way of a young man with no siblings who has been given access to a baby. He would do anything that needed doing near the main house so he could be nearby when Henry was outside. Margaret found this genuinely touching and told him he could hold the baby whenever he liked, which made Billy so pleased he forgot to be awkward about it. The ranch continued to grow. Jonas took on 2 more hands in 1880 as the herd expanded, men named Rodriguez and Harper who were competent and reliable. He extended the south pasture fencing and improved the water system along the creek, and Margaret convinced him to plant a kitchen garden along the east side of the house, which she tended herself with the same systematic dedication she applied to everything. The garden produced better than either of them expected, and B. Fulton asked her for seeds the following spring, which Margaret gave freely and felt unreasonably pleased about. Daniel Slater finally visited in the summer of 1881, a tall, sun-darkened soldier who arrived on the eastbound stage with a duffel and a wide, genuine smile that was clearly Margaret's smile on a bigger face. Jonas met him and sized him up in the way men do when they're meeting the family of someone they love. And Daniel sized Jonas up in the way a brother does when he's meeting the man his sister married. And they shook hands, and something in that handshake was satisfactory to both of them. Daniel stayed 3 weeks. He was good with Henry, who was 14 months old and very interested in Daniel's uniform buttons and his loud laugh. He sat on the porch with Jonas in the evenings while Margaret read inside, and they talked about the ranch and the territory, and the Army's increasingly complicated dealings with the tribes of the Southwest, which Daniel spoke about with more nuance and discomfort than Jonas expected. It was a hard thing, what was happening in the territory. The displacement, the broken agreements, the injustice of it that men like Thomas Runningwater knew directly, and that men like Jonas and Daniel could see if they were honest about looking. Daniel was honest about it. He said the Army was an instrument of policies he did not always agree with, and that he stayed because he could do more good from inside it than outside. And Jonas thought that was probably true, and that the calculation between complicity and influence was one of the harder ones a man could face. Thomas, when Daniel said something similar to him, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "My mother's people have been making that calculation for longer than the Army has existed." Daniel nodded and said, "I know, and I'm sorry." Thomas looked at him and seemed to conclude he meant it. Daniel went back to Wyoming in August. He wrote regularly after that, and his letters grew gradually warmer and more personal. And in the winter of 1882, he mentioned a woman named Clara, not Clara Whitfield, a different Clara altogether, an Army nurse who apparently had strong opinions and dark red hair. And after that his letters changed quality in a way that Margaret recognized immediately. In October of 1882, Margaret told Jonas she was expecting again. He was mending tack in the barn when she came and stood in the doorway and told him, and he set down the tack and crossed to her and took her face between his work-rough hands and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and full that she felt it in her throat. "Are you well?" he asked first because that was who he was. "I'm very well," she said. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, and held her there in the barn doorway with the smell of hay and horses around them and the late October light going gold across the mountains. Their second child was a girl, born in June of 1883. They named her Louise. She was smaller than Henry had been and completely in command from the first hour of her existence. And Henry, who was 3, regarded her with the mixture of deep suspicion and intense interest that older siblings bring to the newcomers who have disrupted their order. Within 2 weeks he was protective of her in the way that would define the rest of his childhood, making himself her self-appointed guardian against any danger, real or imagined. Jonas watched his children grow the way a man watches the thing that makes his life make sense with constant, sometimes inarticulate wonder. He was not a demonstrative father the way some men were, not given to lavish sentiment, but he was present in a way that mattered more than sentiment. Present at breakfast and at supper, and on Sunday mornings when they rode out to see the valley, Henry on his own small horse by the time he was 5 and Louise in front of Jonas on the roan, one small determined hand gripping the saddle horn. Margaret taught at the Redrock schoolhouse until Louise was born, and then arranged with the town for a younger teacher to take the position. A woman named Anne Ferris who came out from Albuquerque, and whom Margaret spent 2 weeks training personally, turning over her methods and her materials with the thoroughness of a woman who wants the thing she's built to outlast her. She missed teaching. She missed it with a specific, identifiable ache that she was honest about with Jonas on a winter evening when Henry was asleep and Louise was newly fed and quiet, and the fire was the only sound in the house. "Then go back," he said. He said it simply, without hesitation. She looked at him. "The children, Rosaria is here. I'm here. There are 5 other people on this ranch who would watch those children with their lives." He looked at her steadily. "Margaret, go back." She did. She arranged it with the town and with Ann Farris, who was competent and who remained as well, making Redrock the beneficiary of 2 good teachers for the price of 2 decent salaries, which was unusual, and which the town council agreed to because Margaret proposed it in a way that was difficult to reasonably refuse. The years settled into the rhythm of the ranch and the school and the seasons, each one bringing its own texture. Henry started coming to the school occasionally to listen to his mother teach, sitting in the back with the older children, bright and restless and asking questions that were occasionally inconveniently advanced. Jonas would see this and say nothing, but the quiet pleasure of it was in his face. In 1885, Billy Greer married a young woman named Iris who had arrived in Redrock to live with her aunt after her own family circumstances back in Missouri had become difficult. Iris was 22 and forthright, and thought Billy was wonderful in a way that Billy found almost overwhelming to receive. They married in the same church where Jonas and Margaret had married, and Margaret cried at the wedding in a way she had not cried at her own, which Jonas found endearing and told her so. "I wasn't nervous at my own wedding," she said. "I was certain. At other people's I get sentimental." "I noticed," he said, handing her his handkerchief, which she took without embarrassment. Thomas and Rosaria had a second child in 1886, a girl they named Ada, and Elias at 7 took on the exact same expression of serious protectiveness that Henry had developed with Louise, which Thomas observed and said made perfect sense. The Cimarron Valley by the mid-1880s was changing, more homesteaders coming through, more of the territory being settled, the wildness being measured and fenced and divided. Jonas watched it with the complicated feelings of a man who was himself a settler, and who could see what the settlement meant for the land, and for the people who had been there before. He talked about it with Thomas, who spoke about it with the knowledge of a man whose heritage existed on both sides of that process. It was not a simple thing, and Jonas did not pretend it was. He made sure his dealings with everyone in the valley, Pueblo, Navajo, settler, merchant, were honest and fair, not because he was trying to make himself feel better, but because that was the only way he knew how to conduct himself. In the spring of 1887, Jonas rode out to the north pasture early one morning to find a section of fence down and 3 of his cattle gone, and when he tracked along the creek, he found a family camped in the cedar break. A man, a woman, and 2 children, clearly in some distress, who had taken the cattle not out of malice but out of hunger. They were settlers who had come through from Texas with too little money and too much optimism and had been weathered badly by the winter. The man was defensive and frightened. His wife held the children close. Jonas sat on his horse and looked at them for a while. Then he said, "Come up to the ranch. My wife will feed you." He said it the way he said everything, simply and without drama. The man looked at him with the particular expression of someone waiting for the other part of that sentence, the part with the sheriff in it. It did not come. They came up to the ranch. Margaret fed them a substantial meal and made up the spare room in the bunkhouse, and in the morning she sat with the woman, whose name was Ann, while Jonas talked to the man, whose name was Frank, about what their situation actually was and what options existed. It turned out that Frank had some skill with horses, and that Jonas needed an additional hand for the spring work, and that the solution was one of the practical ones that required mostly someone to offer it. Frank and Ann Holly stayed on the ranch for 2 years. Frank was a good hand and learned fast. Ann helped with the garden and turned out to have a talent for preserving that improved the ranch's food stores considerably. They moved on in 1889 with enough saved money to make a proper start somewhere north of Santa Fe, and they left on good terms, which Jonas felt was the right way for a thing to end. Margaret, watching them go from the porch with Henry and Louise beside her, said, "That was the right thing you did." "The fence still needed fixing," Jonas said. Jonas. "It was the obvious solution," he said, which was as close as he got to taking credit for a generous impulse. And she smiled and leaned against his shoulder, which she could do now without thinking about it, with the ease of people who have made a physical vocabulary of each other. Henry Abbott was 10 years old and already clearly the young version of his father, the same steadiness, the same economy of words, the same capacity for hard work without complaint. He had Jonas's gray-green eyes and Margaret's directness, which was a formidable combination. He could ride as well as Billy Greer by the time he was 9, which made Billy simultaneously proud and mildly competitive. He already understood cattle well enough that Jonas sometimes consulted his opinion as a kind of test, and occasionally got answers that were perceptive beyond what he expected. Louise was 7, and she was her own entire thing, fiercer and louder than either of her parents, with the absolute conviction of a small person who knows exactly what she thinks and cannot fathom why anyone else would think differently. She had Jonas's dark hair and Margaret's brown eyes, and a personality that appeared to have manifested fresh from the universe without significant reference to either parent. She was studying everything. She followed Thomas around asking questions about the horses with such relentless curiosity that Thomas, who was not a voluble man, found himself explaining more about horses than he had in years because she simply kept asking. Margaret watched Louise and thought, "She will be remarkable. She will also exhaust people regularly. Both of those things are fine." Jonas watched Louise and thought, "She is exactly what I needed her to be. I didn't know it until she existed, but she is exactly right." In the fall of 1889, a letter came from Daniel Slater, and it was not a regular letter. It was an invitation. Daniel was marrying his Clara, the red-headed army nurse with the opinions, in Wyoming in the spring, and he wanted Margaret and Jonas and the children to come. They went. It was the longest trip they had taken as a family, 3 days on the stage, and then a rail connection up through Colorado. And Henry was 11 and absorbed everything with serious interest. And Louise was 8 and became immediately fascinated with the train to the point of interrogating the engineer at every stop, until the man had, against his own intention, given her a thorough explanation of how a steam engine worked. Jonas sat across from Margaret on the train through Colorado and watched the mountains going past and watched his children and felt, with the steady certainty of a man who has stopped being surprised by good things because he has learned to simply receive them, that his life was full in a way he had not once imagined possible when he sat alone on a porch watching a valley that held no one. Daniel's wedding was in a fort chapel in Wyoming, and Clara turned out to be everything the letters had suggested and more practical in the Margaret way, warm in a way that complemented Daniel's gregarious openness, and clearly so entirely devoted to Daniel that it looked like air. Margaret wept again at this wedding, this time with less self-consciousness. Jonas held her hand through the ceremony, and she leaned against his shoulder at the reception, and he put his arm around her in the easy, unremarkable way of a man for whom this kind of closeness has become the natural state of things. Daniel and Clara planned to come to New Mexico after his posting ended, which he thought would be within 2 years. They arrived in 1891, Daniel out of the army now and looking simultaneously lighter and more purposeful, and Clara full of opinions about everything she observed and asking excellent questions about the ranch operation that impressed Jonas, which was not easy to do. Daniel found work at first as a trail guide, and then, with Jonas's assistance in the arrangements, bought a small property 15 miles up the valley and began his own cattle venture. He was not Jonas's level of rancher yet, but he was willing and smart, and Jonas spent several months helping him through the establishment process in the same unhurried way that Thomas had once helped him. Margaret had the deep pleasure of having her brother 15 miles away. They saw each other regularly, and Clara and she became friends in the way of two women who are similarly constituted and who recognize that quality in each other quickly. They rode together on Sundays when the weather allowed and talked about teaching and medicine. Clara had nursing knowledge that Redrock's usually drunk doctor sorely lacked, and the conversations were the kind where 2 hours pass and seem like 20 minutes. In the spring of 1891, Thomas and Rosaria's Elias, who was 12 now and had been following Jonas around the ranch learning everything he could get his hands on, asked Jonas if he could help with the spring roundup as a working hand rather than an observer. Jonas thought about this and said yes. Elias worked 4 days of the roundup alongside Pete and Cal and the other hands, and he was good, not just for 12, but actually good, with his father's feel for the animals and his mother's precision. Jonas told Thomas afterward, and Thomas said simply, "He has been watching you a long time," which Jonas took as the considerable compliment it was. The bell, as Jonas had privately started calling the straight bell, in the way you privately name things that matter, still hung on the Redrock schoolhouse. Margaret still taught there. In 1891, she had been teaching in Redrock for more than a decade, off and on, with the interruptions of Louise and the early years, and the town regarded her as an institution in the way that towns regard the people who do the important work steadily and without making demands. She had taught 2 full generations of Redrock children at this point, and it was not unusual for her to see the grown versions of her earliest students and remember the specific day they had understood something they had not understood before. On a Saturday evening in the fall of 1891, 13 years after Margaret's stagecoach had taken the wrong road in the wrong storm, Jonas and Margaret sat on the porch as they did most evenings when the work was done. Henry was inside doing his letters. He was 13, and Jonas had arranged for correspondence lessons in mathematics and literature from a school in Santa Fe, because Redrock's schoolhouse was fine and Margaret was a fine teacher, but Henry's mind needed more than it could offer. Louise was already in bed, though she was almost certainly reading by lamp light rather than sleeping, which Margaret knew and had decided to be lenient about because the girl would read under any conditions, and there was no point fighting the inevitable. The mountains were doing the purple thing in the dusk. The creek was audible in the distance. The ranch building stood solid and quiet and full of the particular presence of a place that is well used and well loved. The kitchen garden was harvested for the season, and the fence line was in good repair, and the herd was in excellent condition going into winter. Jonas looked at all of this with the steadiness of a man who has made his peace with a place. Margaret sat beside him in the chair that had always been hers, that she had brought into being simply by sitting in it enough times that it became defined by her presence in it, and she held a cup of coffee and watched the mountains, and she thought about the woman she had been on the stage from Denver, heading to Kansas with a practical plan and a steady heart, and no idea what was actually coming. "I was thinking about the storm today," she said. He looked at her. "The one that sent Otis off the wrong road. If it hadn't come," she paused, "I would be in Kansas right now, Mrs. Aldrich teaching school somewhere in Kansas, wondering what I'd missed." She looked at him. "I would not have known I was missing anything, I think, but I would have been. I would have been here," Jonas said. "Alone. Yes. I would not have known either," he said, "what I was missing, but I was." She reached over and took his hand, the rough-palmed hand of a man who had built everything she was looking at, and he turned his hand and held hers the way he always did, completely, without reservation. "The land doesn't care about reasons," she said, quoting what he had told her all those years ago on the hillside. "No," he said, "but I'm grateful for the storm. I'm grateful for Otis," she said, "taking the wrong road. I'm grateful for the broken wheel," he said. "I'm grateful for the tilted bell," she said. He looked at her with those creek-gray eyes that were the same as they had always been, but without the sadness in them now. Not because the sadness had been covered over, but because it had genuinely cleared, the way a sky clears after a storm and is more vividly blue for having been dark. "I'm grateful for you," he said. "I'm grateful for every specific wrong thing that brought you to the right place." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the gathering dark, and they sat together on the porch that he had built for a woman who did not come, which had become the porch that was entirely hers, watching the valley that had become entirely theirs, and the mountains went from purple to black, and the first stars came out overhead in the clean New Mexico sky. Henry came to the doorway and said, "Ma, Pa, it's getting cold." "We're coming," Margaret said, but she didn't move yet, and Jonas didn't move, and Henry retreated with the long-suffering wisdom of a 13-year-old who has learned that his parents sometimes need a few more minutes on the porch. Louise's voice floated from inside. "Henry, come and look at this." Whatever she was reading had claimed her, as things always did, completely. Jonas squeezed Margaret's hand. "We should go in," she said. "In a minute," he said. So they sat another minute in the dark on the porch of the ranch he had built for the wrong woman. And the wrong woman who had arrived by accident was still here 13 years later and would be here every evening after this, and the life between them was full and real. And theirs in the way that only things you didn't plan for and worked hard to keep ever truly are. They went inside. The lamplight was warm in the windows. Louise was explaining something in rapid and detailed terms to Henry that he was only partially attending to. Rosaria had left a pot on the stove for supper. The kitchen smelled of food and wood smoke, and the particular comfort of a home that is lived in hard and loved harder. Jonas hung his hat on the peg by the door, the peg that had been there since he built the house, waiting for exactly this, for the accumulated weight of ordinary evenings, and Margaret set her coffee cup in the basin and touched Louise's shoulder as she passed, and Louise said, "Ma, listen to this," and began reading something aloud in her unstoppable way. And Jonas sat at the kitchen table and listened to his daughter read and his son argue, and his wife respond to both of them with the capable, warm authority that she applied to everything. And outside the ranch was quiet, and the mountains were dark, and the bell on the Redrock schoolhouse hung perfectly straight against the night sky. And everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had been broken had been mended, and the valley held them all in its wide, honest arms, exactly as it always had, and as it would go on doing, unchanged and unchanging in the way that land is when the people on it are finally, completely, precisely where they are supposed to be. Henry was eventually sent to the school in Santa Fe at 15, and he came back at 18 with the same steadiness and a new precision of mind that served him well in the running of the ranch, as Jonas gradually brought him more into the operations. Louise, at 16, had already surpassed what Redrock's schoolhouse could offer her, and Margaret wrote to a women's college in Colorado on her behalf. And the correspondence that followed, full of Louise's fierce and articulate application, resulted in an acceptance that made Margaret cry with pride, and Jonas stand in the yard for a moment by himself in the way that Thomas had once stood when his son was named. Louise went to college in Colorado at 18 and came back to New Mexico eventually, years later, with a degree in natural science and opinions about land management that she immediately began applying to the Abbott Ranch with Jonas's amused, admiring cooperation. By then Henry had taken over most of the daily ranch management, and Jonas was the senior presence, still working, still present, but with the ease of a man who has handed over the weight of the main work to capable hands and can now tend the things he chooses. He tended the porch. He tended the evening conversations with Margaret that had become the finest part of every day. He tended the kitchen garden that she had started 30 years ago, and that now produced far more than any of them could use, the surplus going regularly to be Fulton's daughter, who had inherited her mother's restaurant and the same good understanding of food. Thomas and Rosaria grew old alongside them in the way of people who have been genuinely beside each other through everything, And Elias ran a horse operation of his own by his late 20s that was one of the finest in the territory. And Ada became a teacher in the Redrock school in a line of succession that could be traced directly back to Margaret's 3 days of substitute teaching in 1878. Daniel and Clara, 15 miles up the valley, were as much a part of the Abbott ranch life as any of its own inhabitants. Sunday dinners rotated between the two properties, and the combined family children, grandchildren, Thomas's family, Billy and Iris Greer, and their 3 children. The accumulation of a life well lived in a particular place filled rooms in a way that Jonas sometimes stood back from for a moment, and simply looked at, with the precise, quiet astonishment of a man for whom the fullness of things is still slightly miraculous. He had built his ranch for a woman who left, and the woman who arrived by accident on a storm-misdirected stage with chalk dust on her dress, and the instinct to climb broken ladders to straighten tilted bells had turned out to be the architecture of everything. Not just the ranch, everything. Every year, every morning on the porch, every child and grandchild and friend and hand and neighbor who comprised the substance of a life that was more than he had planned for and exactly what he had needed. Margaret, at 60, still taught. She taught less formally. She mentored Ada. She helped with the older students. She read with the children who needed more time and more patience than a single teacher could give. She was exactly as direct as she had always been, and exactly as honest, and exactly as likely to climb something to fix something if she thought it needed fixing, which Jonas still worried about, and she still did anyway. And the relationship between those two things had remained affectionate and unchanging for 34 years. On a spring evening in the full green of the Cimarron Valley, when the mountains were lavender in the long sunset, and the creek was running with snowmelt, and the kitchen garden was showing its first green shoots of the season, Jonas sat on the porch and Margaret brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in her chair beside him, and the mountains did the purple thing, and the sky cleared to the deep blue that comes after a good rain, which it had been, and the air was clean and cold and full of sage. They had been married 34 years. Their children were grown. Their grandchildren, Henry's boy, 7 years old and already interested in horses, Henry's daughter, 3, Louise's eventual husband's family folding into theirs with the gradual warmth of a good addition, were the continuing thing, the evidence that life keeps going forward. Thomas was on the porch of his own house with Rosaria. The light from their window was warm. Everything was in order. Everything that had ever been broken had been mended. Everything that had been built right. Everything that had been loved fully. Jonas looked at the valley and then he looked at Margaret, who was looking at the mountains with the expression she always had, watching them, peaceful, interested, present. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked. "About the storm," he said. "In 1878. She turned to look at him, and the look on her face was so warm and familiar and entirely her own that it made his chest ache in the way it had always made his chest ache, not less with time but differently, deeper, more certain. "Thank God for the storm," she said. "Thank God for the storm," he agreed. She took his hand. The valley held them, as it always had, in the wide, honest arms of a country that does not care about reasons, only about what is true. And what was true was this: the ranch, the land, the life, the children, the creek, the mountains going purple at evening, the kitchen garden and the tilted then straight bell and the corn bread left on a schoolhouse step without a name on it, all of it was exactly what it was supposed to be. All of it was home. All of it was enough. All of it, from the storm on forward, had been the most fortunate accident of either of their lives, and they had made of it something that would last beyond them, in the children who carried their names, and the land that carried their work, and the town that had once watched a stranger climb a broken ladder to fix a bell nobody asked her to fix, and had known, even before Jonas knew, that she was already exactly where she belonged. The stars came out over the Cimarron Valley, one by one and then all at once, and the night settled over the ranch with the particular peace of a place that has been loved for a long time, and inside the house the lamps were lit and the family was there. And on the porch Jonas Abbott sat with his wife in the dark and held her hand, and needed nothing else and wanted nothing else and would have nothing taken back. Not the grief, or the loneliness, or the ranch built for the wrong woman. Because all of it had been the road that led here, and here was everything.